giant of limitless power at man's command. And where was it science found that giant? In the atom, a particle so infinitely small that it takes over 100 billion atoms to make up the head of a pin.
This is Out of the Basement, a podcast dedicated to radiation medicine.
This is Dr. Jason Beckta coming at you from the spooky Vermont mountain basements with what ended up being the craziest story I could possibly tell. This is not what I set out to make for this, and it is certainly not what I want to be doing. And by way of warning, if anyone looked at the timestamp on this, I think we're clocking in at over 2 hours. And the reason for that is, one, the story is insane, and two, I needed to provide some context for those of us who are younger than me or not as into the rad-onc scene. And I think for this particular episode, what we're going to be talking about, there's a lot of context that is required. And the disclaimer up front is that pretty much everything in here is allegations, even if they have been decided at trial. I am not accusing anyone of anything, and that is actually the point, is that the point of anything I am doing is I just want us to all be on the same page, that transparency is good, honesty is good, and we have never been that great about that as a specialty, and certainly this year it has been very disappointing to see some of the behavior from some of our leadership. And so I am doing this episode out of an obligation to myself and our patients and each other, in that I feel like if I don't do this, it is not going to be done. What an intro, huh? So we are going to be yet again talking about ROCR, the radiation oncology case rate proposal, in a roundabout way, sort of. It's all about ROCR until it goes away or changes. But let me pause there for a second. Just to be again clear with the nuance, I am not against case rate payments, or whatever you want to call them, episodic payments, value-based payment, whatever. Not against the concept. And that's the nuance that trips a lot of folks up. It's okay to not agree 100%. You can agree with something 60% of the way. Still okay to do. That is not a thing we're doing so great in the world right now. I am certainly not against the concept, or even actually a lot of the ROCR proposal in general. I am against the speed and secrecy and the seemingly lack of willingness to engage in stakeholder input. And the original version, I believe, was published by CMS in 2019 or whatnot. Doesn't matter. The point being, for literal years, we debated case rate payments, episodic payments. For literal years, papers were published about this. For literal years, many people from many different institutions and backgrounds had a lot of quite good ideas about how to improve ROAPM, and seemingly we forgot all about that when talking about ROCR, because ROCR is skeleton APM, basically, where sure, the base rates are better, and sure, the strange reporting requirements are not there, at least not in the same way. But if you go back and read those old APM papers, especially some of which were written by the people who helped write ROCR, at least one of them, or two of them, and I guess that just didn't happen, which is the theme with ASTRO in general. Just delete it and it doesn't happen. So as hard as it is for me to say this, because it means I'm getting older, it strikes me that some of the younger folks in this specialty might not know what the term 21C means. Back in the day, we all used to know what 21C was, and I have come to realize that's no longer a guarantee. 21C stands for, or represents, 21st Century Oncology, which in the last decade was one of, or the biggest private radiation oncology practice in the country, maybe in the world, actually. Well, we'll see. So they were traded on the NASDAQ, and actually, instead of me blathering on from memory about what they were, I'm going to take from the SEC filings the Form 10K, which is what they put out for investors, or all companies do, and that will describe their history much better than I could bumble on about it.
We operate the largest integrated network of cancer treatment centers and affiliated physicians in the world, which, as of December 31st, 2013, was comprised of approximately 671 community-based physicians in the fields of radiation, oncology, medical oncology, breast, gynecological and general surgery, urology, and primary care. Our physicians provide medical services at approximately 304 locations, including our 163 radiation therapy centers, of which 41 operate in partnership with health systems. Our cancer treatment centers in the United States are operated predominantly under the 21st Century Oncology brand and are strategically clustered in 31 local markets in 16 states. Our 33 international treatment centers in 6 Latin American markets are operated under the 21st Century Oncology brand, or a local brand, and, in many cases, are operated with local minority partners, including hospitals.
So a decade ago, this is why everyone, I shouldn't say everyone, but people generally knew what 21C was in the radiation oncology community. So there is obviously more to their history, which is somewhat relevant to this story, but mostly the purpose of this podcast and other works like it is that we are trying to preserve a oral history here, or preserve history in general. Also from the SEC Form 10K, here is a little bit more.
Our company was founded in 1983 by a group of physicians that came together to deliver academic-level quality radiation therapy at the community level. With significant investment in clinical programs, operating infrastructure, and business systems, we expanded our delivery of sophisticated radiation therapy services domestically and then globally. We were incorporated on October 9, 2007, under the name Radiation Therapy Services Holdings, and currently exist as a Delaware corporation. On December 5, 2013, we changed our name to 21st Century Oncology Holdings. We were acquired in 2008 pursuant to the merger by affiliates of Vestor Capital Partners. As of December 31, 2013, we were affiliated with 156 radiation oncologists in the United States that were employed or under contract with us, or our affiliated professional corporations. We have $991.7 million of total debt outstanding as of December 31, 2013.
So obviously they were a giant company, and really it was $1 billion in debt, in case people thought that it was an exaggeration if they had heard that and thought, no way, no, yes way. And this is just looping into how acquisitions by venture capital will put companies in high leverage situations and so on and so forth, and a story for another time. But in the first 20 years of the company, they did expand, but it really took off, as with everything else, with the advent of IMRT in the early 2000s, which is a whole other story for a whole other time, which I know I've talked about it ad nauseum at other points. But this obviously got on everyone's radar. They were traded on the NASDAQ in 2004, and I was personally not in the radiation oncology scene in the beginning for all this, obviously. I'm getting old, but not that old. And given that I was also either in the Northeast or the Mid-Atlantic for the duration of my entire life, actually, but I was not in the Florida scene except when I'm visiting my in-laws. I really only became aware of 21st Century Oncology when they became 21st Century Oncology and really started to become massive. One of the reasons I became aware of them was the tremendous number of lawsuits that they were involved in, usually around qui tam or whistleblower cases, and later on an antitrust case. But it's hard to go through and tease out every piece of it, because when you go back and try to read about these things, you'll have the initial sort of publications around the complaint or the allegation. And of course, an allegation is, we're in America, we're innocent until proven guilty. So you'll get the reporting on the story, and then whether or not, especially if there's a guilty verdict or if the civil suit is successful or if there's a settlement and so on and so forth, then you'll see appeals. And really, especially as the internet has just taken over everything over the last 20 years, you'll just be able to find everything, and putting together a cohesive timeline can sometimes be very confusing, especially when you get into companies like this or anything in healthcare with a highly regulated market and very complicated terms and corporations that have partnerships with global alliances, with venture firms, with yada and yada. So skipping ahead from the litany of stories that can be found in the first 30 years of the company's history, for our purposes, things get interesting about a decade ago when there was a successful settlement where 21C paid the federal government $19.75 million in 2015 based on a whistleblower claim that is summarized as follows.
The False Claims Act lawsuit alleged that 21st Century Oncology had performed and billed federal healthcare programs for fluorescence in situ hybridization, FISH cancer tests that were not medically necessary, between 2008 and 2012. It also claimed that the whistleblower had been wrongfully fired and threatened following her disclosure of the company's wrongdoings. The Department of Justice named 4 urologists in connection with the unnecessary medical test claims. The legal proceedings also revealed that 21st Century encouraged its professionals to order more FISH tests by offering financial incentives tied to the number of tests they referred to, a lab that was also operated by 21st Century Oncology. Allegedly Stark law violations and anti-kickback law violations, which respectively prohibit referring to providers with common ownership and incentives for medical referrals. According to the lawsuit, a urologist would alter patients' medical records to reflect traces of blood in urine, then falsely diagnosing hematuria, a common symptom of bladder cancer. With the suspicion of the cancer came the need for the lucrative testing.
That's certainly something. So, reading more from one of the reports from the time, the whistleblower who was a medical assistant for one of the urologists claimed in the lawsuit that the urologist diligently, that's a good word choice, destroyed evidence by having the original negative test shredded. And yikes, just being a doctor myself, that is wild. There are many things I have done in my life, and doing anything even remotely like this has never even crossed my mind. This is one of the, as a sidebar here, one of the biggest disappointments was first when I realized adults didn't know what they were doing when you're a kid and you think everyone's got it all figured out, and then you're not a kid, and wow, that's an ontological shock. But then when you become a doctor, at least I'm a first-generation college student, first-generation physician, and I just had this kind of pristine, idyllic view of science and medicine and just the amazing objective meritocracy I was getting myself into, which is part of the reason I wanted to do this. And alas, I was wildly incorrect. So there are scumbags everywhere, and it doesn't matter if you are a doctor or you are a drug dealer. Doctors are drug dealers in a way, legally. I'm working on my stand-up routine. Anyway, further on this particular article, so based on Medicare's billing records for 2012, 21C's pathologists billed the government for more FISH tests than any other laboratory in the U.S. In fact, a 2014 report from the OIG on questionable billing for Medicare made reference to a Florida lab that met its 5 criteria for questionable billing, although the report did not refer to it by name. The lab was later identified as 21C, and so this article goes on to talk about how the average Medicare reimbursement per 21C physician had been $107,700 in 2010, a figure that amounts to 24 times the average for non-independent labs across the country. The average Medicare reimbursement per patient was a staggering $1,193, where the national average was about $70. That's the first part, but for those of us who are earlier mid-career, might not have been around here, and I talked about this in previous episodes, part of when the government took aim at us and the ineffectual defense that ASTRO and others had mounted was around the stark self-referral laws with urologists. So you got to remember that around this time, in that 2008 to 2012 or 2015 timeframe, that was the main drum being beat. And to be clear, I do talk about that pejoratively. It was actually a thing, which is how this particular lawsuit or article about the lawsuit closes out, talking about how the White House, again, this was back 10 years ago, White House had repeatedly recommended narrowing the scope of Stark Law's in-office ancillary service exemption, and that was because there was a report estimating that it would save Medicare $6 billion over 10 years' time. The recommendations by the White House were confronted by lobbying from 8 radiation oncology labs, including 21C, and the effort failed to gain support from the Senate. Through both donations from its chairman's family and political action committee, 21C has spent in excess of $600,000 on political lobbying over the last 7 years. And yeah, so that's what it kicks off about a decade ago. So item 1, 24 times the average physician reimbursement for this fish thing, and whistleblowers and getting fired and destroying tests and making up results and doing workups and cool. That's not even, that is the appetizer. So let's get into the next claim, shall we?
21st Century Oncology and its wholly owned subsidiary, South Florida Radiation Oncology, have agreed to settle False Claims Act's allegations for $34.7 million. The settlement relates to defendants' use of a medical procedure, called the gamma function, to measure the exit dose of radiation from a patient after receiving radiation treatment. The United States alleged that the defendants knowingly and improperly billed for this procedure under circumstances where the procedure served no medically appropriate purpose. For example, the government alleged that the procedure was performed by physicians and physicists at 21st Century Oncology locations who were not properly trained to interpret and utilize the gamma function results. The government also alleged that the defendants billed for this procedure when no physician reviewed the gamma function results until 7 or more days after the last day patients received radiation treatment therapy. Finally, the government alleged that the defendants billed for the procedure when no gamma result was available due to technical failures in the imaging equipment.
All right, so that one is probably what I would consider the most famous, at least in my circles, famous lawsuit from the 21C days. And if you've ever heard me or others make jokes about doing daily in vivo dosimetry, this is what I'm referencing. And I didn't put it together until I was researching and putting all of this together, that in the SEC filings from the intro from earlier, this gamma function test was actually really touted just a few years before as one of the reasons why 21C would be so profitable. Very palpable irony. The other thing about this is that this is the Joe Ting case. So Joseph Ting was the relator in the QTAM case. He's a medical physicist, and so in QTAM cases, it's this whole thing about treble damages, where it's however much you quote unquote defrauded the government times 3. And then in these cases where if they are successful, the relator, the whistleblower who brought the case in the first place, gets a third of it. So he got $7 million. Now, obviously, I don't remember. I think that's taxed. I don't know. I can't remember, and I'm not going to go look that up. But usually then also your attorneys get paid. But Joe Ting, I don't know if he's still out and about, but some folks might know him. And he's actually, I believe, there's a YouTube video with him that I saw. I think he did a promo spot for the government saying whistleblowing is good. I swear the AARP was also in that spot. It was funny. It was weird, but go him. So anyway, that is the daily in vivo case. And then we've got an additional one from basically the following year. We're going to circle back and do a timeline on this in a second, but let's go on to number 3.
21st Century Oncology and certain of its subsidiaries and affiliates have agreed to pay $26 million to the government to resolve a self-disclosure relating to the submission of false attestations regarding the company's use of electronic health record software and separate allegations that they violated the False Claims Act by submitting or causing the submission of claims for certain services provided pursuant to referrals from physicians with whom they had improper financial relationships. The settlement announced today resolves conduct that was self-disclosed by the company regarding payments made by the government as part of the Medicare Electronic Health Records, EHR, incentive program. Under the Medicare EHR incentive program, physicians who attest to their meaningful use of certified EHR technology may receive incentive payments and avoid downward adjustments to certain Medicare claims. As part of its self-disclosure, 21st Century Oncology reported that it knowingly submitted or caused the submission of false attestations to CMS concerning employed physicians' use of EHR software. The company further reported that, in support of the attestations, its employees falsified data regarding the company's use of EHR software, fabricated software utilization reports, and superimposed EHR vendor logos onto the reports to make them look legitimate.
To summarize the timeline again here, so you get 1983-ish is when the core of what was 21C began, and you had a long stretch of relatively normal in terms of private practice radiation oncology operations. And then in 2008 is when you get this leverage buyout with Vestar, And it was built on the assumption of this incredibly rapid growth strategy. When you are bought out for $1 billion, that's it. That has to be the strategy. And it's really, as I'm doing this episode, it is really just striking to me how quick all of this played out. And that I think that part is lost in the conversation, where I remember living through this and you'd hear piecemeals of it, and I had never sat down, or it had never been presented to me as a sort of singular story about how this all played out. And so I'm pulling things from multiple different sources. But in an investor pitch deck from 21C from 2007, they were traded on the NASDAQ from 2004 to at least 2007. I believe it was when that Vestar acquisition happened that they went private again. But so traded on the NASDAQ. And then this is the other part that ties into something I like to talk about all the time, is people just forget in general how rapidly things changed in radiation oncology over just a short period of time. And for people like me, if you trained within the last 10 years, there's VMAT era, right? Like we take for granted, we got cone beams on a LINAC and you're doing VMAT, but that all had only showed up the decade before. So in that investor pitch deck from 2007, they were using 3D conformal radiotherapy throughout the 1990s, as everyone was, and then just like everyone started to get it in 2002 is when IMRT started to roll out. 2006 was IGRT, and then 2007 was radiosurgery. And so then in 2008, you get the leveraged buyout for $1 billion. And then in October 2013, they being 21C Holdings, buys out OnCure Holdings from bankruptcy, which was another oncology company. And then 2 months later, in December of 2013, that's when they changed their name to 21st Century Oncology. And then in 2014, they buy another oncology practice, SFRO, the South Florida Holdings, or at least they invest heavily. The terminology gets confusing. So you have that insane stretch from 2008. It's all from 2008 to 2016. You have that business stuff going on, and then you have these lawsuits or these antitrust allegations of the first one with the fish tests, and then you have the gamma function whistleblower with Joe Ting and daily in vivo imaging, and then you have the data breach and the EHR allegations. That's an insane 8-year stretch. And so throughout this time, before Vestar came in 2008, Daniel Doseritz was one of the managing partners, and then in 2008, he was the CEO throughout the whole time, and then he steps down in 2016 and goes to Advocate, which is something we'll get to in a minute here. And that's nuts. And in the middle of all this, or at the end of all this, they declare bankruptcy. They declare Chapter 11 bankruptcy because obviously they did. And the story of bankruptcy is a very interesting thing. And a lot of these things that apply to at scale don't apply to us in W-2 employed hospital positions or on a household level. Like a lot of this stuff is just wild and only works at scale here. The issue was they were obviously over leveraged. They had too much debt, and they were acquired with basically 10x their kind of yearly revenue, and they just couldn't keep up. And so there's companies out here that do research on this, and so there's one called Third Bridge. So Third Bridge had interviewed one of the 21C executives about this period of time, and it's very interesting to hear about their perception of how the bankruptcy started. And in healthcare, I feel this story in my soul. Here's an excerpt from that interview.
21C had built a network that was actually, now looking back, pretty sophisticated, because they had acquired small groups one at a time here and there, and a big part of where their efficiencies came was from having a centralized data warehouse. We had all these different systems all feeding into one data warehouse, and we, as across the nation from revenue from everyone, could share that data warehouse without having individual logins for each data system. That was a lot of money each time you get a user. Unfortunately, with OnCure, they had no infrastructure of that nature. Everyone was a standalone. They had a lot of paper charts. The EMRs were not being used to its full potential. It became something that 21C didn't know how to manage. They had no experience with that because they had a very robust infrastructure as far as their network, and that became their priority, was to bring them on board, which, little by little, within the first probably 6 months, ate up $20 million, which is when they tried to go public. That's when they went out. They were counting on that money to go public and get more funds for this acquisition, and to continue the integration, and as that did not work. They were not successful when they tried to go public, and that actually began the end of it, because of the fact that they acquired all of that counting on going public.
So they continue on for a couple years after that. And in May of 2017, 21st Century filed for bankruptcy, and it listed debts of approximately $1.3 billion and assets of about $814 million. It emerged from bankruptcy in January 2018, and it had erased $500 million from that. Then an attorney was appointed CEO or interim CEO in January 2018, and then there was a consortium of 6 equity owners with names that we all probably know and love of Beach Point Capital, Governor's Lane, JP Morgan, Oak Tree, Roy Stone, and HPS, and the crew that may or may not own the world. And basically, remember, you had that period of several years of just unrestrained growth, and ultimately about those allegations, or the cost of those allegations, were about $55 million to settle with the government. And however, it didn't, again, admit any wrongdoing, so allegations. And then in November of 2017, 21C signed a 5-year corporate integrity agreement with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, OIG, and it had to hire a compliance officer and do all this, that, and the other thing. And then the key part of this, or one of the key parts of this, was Danny Doseritz, who is a larger-than-life figure in radiation oncology. And if you're in radiation oncology and you don't know who that is, you must be younger than me. But so that was a key part of this when he left. I'm going to say left. I can only go on what is public information or things. I honestly don't know the true story of any of this in terms of, because I didn't live any of it. All the stuff I'm talking about here is stuff that you can find published in various outlets. And just to be clear, obviously, I've heard other gossip things about this entire story, and I will keep those to myself. I'm only sticking with what is in the public record. So going back to that Third Bridge interview with the mysterious former 21C executive who I think was on the West Coast. And to be clear, I'm not being coy. They keep them anonymous. I don't know who that was, but this is what that executive had to say about it.
The issue was it actually started during the bankruptcy. And this again is published information. Their leader, Dr. Doseritz, was removed. And honestly, at the crux of what kept that together was, somehow Dr. Doseritz had a way of working with the physicians. It was more physician-centric in that, honestly, if a physician called him and was literally livid, he would fly out here. He'd fly out all over the place to come and act in person and speak with that doctor and try to get to the bottom. And that meant a lot to the doctors, and that's what they were used to, for good or for bad. Whether they ended up arguing with those writs or not, that's the kind of relationship they had shared. And they trusted a fellow physician, or at least they could speak the same language. When he left, then it became a very difficult relationship with the physicians. The physicians did not trust the leadership. It was an attorney. And that was the beginning of a lot of dissatisfaction on the behalf of the physician. It became a very difficult relationships for the new attorney CEO to manage. And she brought on as many people as she could to help her, but from then it soured.
And it was interesting for me when I read this article, because while I have never met Danny Doseritz in person, I've heard this independently corroborated over the years by multiple other individuals, so I have to think it's true. There's a lot of things that have been said about the history here, but this has been a pretty consistent message that I have heard, and this interview goes on to continue a little bit further with it.
One of the things that, I'll be honest with you, that I really loved about 21C, this is not new and this is why the doctors loved them. 21C would tell the doctors, you do what you think is best and we'll figure it out later. That was probably a great selling point for the doctors, but the reality is that the payers make the final decision as to what they're going to cover and not cover, and there are ways to get around that. I know that right now, Medicare is looking at different pay models, and there's one where they could possibly remove all of that and just pay you, not a capitation, but by either diagnosis or just say, cancer patients get an X number of dollars, and you treat how you think is best. If they could get there, then yes, that would be a difference. But once again, that's just not reality here.
All right, so 30 minutes in, we're finally getting to the point of this episode here, which I know it was a long intro, but it needs to be set up this way. And the story obviously goes on, and it's probably stuff that I'll cover in the future. It goes on with the GenesisCare acquisition, and then GenesisCare declaring bankruptcy, and there's a lot of that. It's just kind of overwhelming to think about because it has a lot of implications for the rest of us, even though many of us have nothing to do with this company or these companies or any of this. But the year is a trickle-down effect, trickle-down Bremsstrahlung, as it were. And part of why I also wanted to set this up is I have consistently, when I do these podcasts and whatnot, try to avoid talking about people I know or things that I am directly involved in for a multitude of reasons. But so obviously, again, I have never met Danny Doseritz or relevant folks like that in person. His son was at Yale and finished a few years before me, and I know him through, I've talked to him, but we know mutual people, and it's radiation oncology. We're small, too many doctors. Again, too many of us is the message, but we're small. We all know each other. And I have to say my personal interactions have been nothing but positive. So that's what really frustrates me about all this too, is that when you hear these things, these are problematic. This whole story is problematic. And so it's very easy, and you see this a lot of people deriding 21C or things like this, and that you see these people or talk to them in real life, and I have had nothing but positive sort of interactions and have heard just it's good people. And it's funny putting this all together in one place because one of my favorite rants, I have a lot of favorite rants, it might be a me problem, is I will never forget a board question. Now, I do forget which boards. I think it was for one of the USMLEs. It might have been step 1. I've taken a lot of exams, but there was a question about who is ultimately responsible. And so the setup was essentially one of the staff members of a hospital, like a nurse or something, had a chart open, like a paper chart or a computer screen or whatnot, with patient information, and individual, like a visitor, walks by and sees it and sees something they shouldn't have, and then tells somebody about it. And all of this happens at 10 p.m. And so you're the day shift doctor or whatnot. And then something happens, and the point of the question was, who is ultimately responsible? And it's me, it's you, it's if you're a doctor. And that is the whole crux of what drives a lot of my activity here or otherwise, is that ignorance is not an excuse, and knowing or not knowing about healthcare finances or how things get paid, and that's usually the drum I'm beating. But basically, the way the system is built is that we are the ultimate backstop. We are the end, and in some cases, we are the scapegoat. And that's the problem, in some senses, when you give up authority or delegate authority, unwillingly delegate, to corporations or institutions, because at the end of the day, you get hung out to dry. You're on the line. And so especially with that first antitrust case, the fish case, that was, and again, I don't know all of the details about it, but 21C was chugging along, doing its own thing, acquired all these practices. And so they happened to acquire this problematic practice. And at the end of the day, it's on them. And if they hadn't acquired that practice, then that wouldn't have been on them. And it's a theme for a lot of these things where it's the problem in healthcare markets in general. But you could be the sweetest person on the planet, and if you are running a company and employs one problematic doctor, there you go. And then it's really easy, because humans are very tribal and we're built, our brains, to work in a certain way. You then can extrapolate the actions of a bad actor to everyone else. And the point being that this is all nuanced. And the point of the Third Bridge interview, or well, that wasn't the point. The point for me is, why did I set all this up? And it's about, again, my favorite, ROCR. The problem I have with ROCR, one of many, obviously, is there is a very relevant part to this 21C story, to ROCR, that no one is talking about, and I am concerned about why. So I have debated, there's a lot of ways that I could approach this part of the story, the actual point of this, and I think it will be easiest if I just approach it chronologically in terms of how I discovered or read through these things, because it's going to be a little bit out of order in terms of absolute timelines, if you believe in linear time, which I don't know if I do. But so we're going to go in how I went down this rabbit hole. I'm not just ranting about payment models in isolations. I'm trying to actually genuinely understand if we are on the right track, or if there is a right track, or if there is just nothing good that's going to come out of this ever. I don't know. I don't believe that. Obviously, I'm joking. But I have basically read every single payment model thing, payment economic thing related to radiation oncology that has come out over the last 20 years. It's probably a slight exaggeration, but the people who know me know that I don't sleep. And obviously I'm making this podcast and have produced over 24 of these things by myself. I like nerdy rad-onc stuff. When I was going through, imagine my surprise to discover that in 2012, there was a pilot payment program done between 21st Century Oncology and Humana, a rad-onc case rate program, a program that looks very similar to ROCR down to who helped write it. I'm going to quote first from a paper that was published in the Red Journal in 2014. Its title is A Feature, Healthcare Payment Reform in the United States, Two Viewpoints. And the title is Design and Implementation of Bundled Payment Systems for Cancer Care and Radiation Therapy, with the authors being, there's a total of 3. And then the first author is Benjamin Fallett, who shown up on a lot of these things earlier back in the decade. But the senior author is Konstantin Mance, who is arguably the architect of ROCR. And so you guys can go find this paper yourselves. I'm going to try to put a lot of links together because I'm trying to get better about that. But it's just on the Red Journal website. It was received February 4th, 2014, and then came back after revisions on April 2nd, 2014, and was accepted on April 11th, 2014. And here is the first excerpt.
In August 2012, 21st Century Oncology and Humana executed the first agreement between a provider and a major health insurer to reimburse external beam radiation therapy services on an episodic basis for almost all cancer cases. The agreement defines the episode as beginning at consultation and ending 90 days after treatment. 13 common cancer diagnoses are included, comprising nearly 90% of all cancer patients treated with external beam radiation therapy. Payment is triggered by consultation with the radiation oncologist and processed in full immediately. Each cancer-specific episodic payment was determined by aggregating the fee schedule payments of all clinically appropriate radiation therapy services for each treatment option, and then weight averaging the data according to the observed distribution of treatments. In other words, episodic modeling of resource utilization and cost was not based on a narrow definition of a single clinical pathway, but instead on the observed variability of care. For example, the design of the breast cancer episodic payment was constructed with the understanding that some early-stage patients are best served with standard fractionation, whereas others can be adequately treated with hypofractionation or accelerated partial breast radiation. Similarly, the lung cancer case rate took into account that some patients are treated with lower-cost 3D CRT, whereas others are treated with higher-cost IMRT.
I wish I had recorded me finding this and understanding what this was, because I have not heard anyone breathe a word of this entire time this year. ROCR was surprise dropped on the rest of us back in June of 2023. It is currently October 14th. This episode is being recorded over many days, but we're mid-October. And I haven't heard anything about this, which is strange considering the singular person who has shown up on the webinars and everything was Dr. Mance. And you would assume that this would be brought up. Now, when I first read this and saw this, and I was wondering to myself, maybe they're so dissimilar. Still, no matter what, this should have probably been brought up. But maybe they're so dissimilar that it doesn't matter. And so here's how they describe it. Again, this is edited a bit. You can go read the paper in full. But because there's not a ton of details, but so here's the relevant parts. Think about ROCR as you listen to this.
Prorated refunds are made to Humana for incomplete care episodes in accordance with the ratio of delivered to prescribed treatment. With this first pass at episodic payments, 21st Century Oncology and Humana did not require quality metrics as a condition of payment or otherwise adjust reimbursement according to outcomes. As mentioned above, meaningful outcome metrics are difficult to implement because they require long-term follow-up of patients and accurate risk adjustment algorithms. Similarly, it proved operationally difficult to create meaningful process metrics, such as conformance to national guidelines, that would protect against underutilization within episodes. Any attempt to collect, transmit, and verify the clinical and anatomic detail necessary to demonstrate appropriate use of more resource-intensive treatments would have vitiated the projected administrative savings. 21st Century Oncology is actively exploring the feasibility of quality-based bonus payments for future iterations, but in the meantime, it is required to submit data to Humana on technology and service utilization. 21st Century Oncology and Humana mitigated this risk by limiting the term of their agreement to 1 year. The bundled price for each disease site is renegotiated on a yearly basis, taking into account any clinical developments. This strategy also protects the payer from developments that indicate that more expensive elements of a patient's care are no longer indicated. After 12 months of implementation, 21st Century Oncology observed a few positive outcomes. Resource utilization and physician prescribing habits for the Humana population remained greater than 98% compliant to the recommended types and number of services modeled in each diagnosis group. Clinically appropriate hypofractionation increased, particularly for breast cancer, and 21st Century Oncology modeled substantial savings associated with reduced administrative burden. Finally, Press Ganey patient satisfaction surveys administered to Humana patients before and after implementation of the bundle revealed a consistently high level of overall satisfaction, with a statistically significant increase in perceived ease of insurance approval. Additional time is required to determine whether the shift to episodic payments reduced Humana's overall spending and/or improved outcomes for its patients.
Yeah, so that's pretty similar to ROCR in as far as we can tell, this has been one of my other issues, is that the documentation and things that we've been allowed to see thus far are light on details, which is why I've been vocal on X about seeing if we can actually see a legislative draft, because to compare and contrast what was put out for ROAPM compared to ROCR are very different in terms of volume and level of detail, and so it's really hard here to precisely compare and contrast. But the key ones being it is still the same sort of concept of instead of per fraction, it is by disease site, by diagnosis. It is 21C has 13 disease sites, ROCR has 15. This is triggered at time of consultation. I believe ROCR, actually, honestly, because it's a whole other thing I'm working on with Freedom of Information Act requests and ROAPM and stuff so I might be jumbling it together, but I believe ROCR is triggered at time of 77263, or time of dropping the clinical treatment planning code, whereas this is time of consultation. This is done with, I don't recall in ROCR talking about paying back, so that first bit there of because consultation triggers payment, which is an interesting move. I'm not quite sure how that worked, but because consultation triggered payment, if they did not finish it, then 21C would pay Humana back, prorated, allegedly, and they did not do any sort of quality type stuff. So that was one of the big knocks on APM, was that there was a lot of these intense sort of metric reporting requirements. ROCR ostensibly obviates that by having this major conflict of interest of you can be certified by things like ASTRO by having your practice accredited, whereas that was clearly not used here. And this was done, remember, this was being written and done in 2012, so the hypofrac guidelines did not come out until 2018. And which is really driving a lot of why I talk about ROCR it's one thing about Medicare payments, those are low anyway, but what ASTRO does is the tail wagging the dog. And so whatever ASTRO does, payers will adopt in the most conservative manner possible, meaning their profit margins remain good. So when the hypofrac guidelines were published by ASTRO, and same with choosing wisely and breast IMRT and stuff, that influenced how we were forced to practice by payers. And so there was none of that when this was written. So it's interesting to think about, and that's the issue with all of these things, is trying to consider the contextual time frame of when these were done. So 2012, no hypofrac guidelines. The severe bundling of IMRT that would take place eventually was not done until 2015, and that was for hospitals, not for freestanding. That's a whole other thing that involves 21C, but it was a different time. But the one thing this doesn't talk about is price. This is all about money. Everything's always about money. And that is one thing they don't talk about. And they mention that, because you got to remember, this was agreed to in 2012. This particular paper was published in 2014. And so it's at least 1 year of data. Bare minimum, because this was submitted in February of 2014, and this agreement came into place in late 2012, in September of 2012. So at least 12 months of data. You don't have any financials to put in this paper to sell it. So one thing you don't have, and So it's worth going through, and I won't, this podcast will be 20 hours if I do it, reading ROCR for those who are this far into it and interested. And then it's very similar to what this is. Then, of course, finding this, I read this 10 times. That's an exaggeration, but I read this a couple times because I just couldn't believe what I was reading here. This has never been mentioned anywhere. I was flabbergasted. That triggered me to go down an entire rabbit hole of trying to find if anything was published about this. All right, fine. We're not talking about it now, or it's not being talked about now, which is weird. But maybe back a decade ago, because this was still when 21C was 21C. This was before the first bankruptcy. This was before ROAPM had come in. This was before all of that. It seems like they're playing games now. The games they were playing back then were different. There should be no reason to not talk about this. So I could find barely anything. And the one thing I could find, the spoiler alert is I did find things about the money, not in the way they want me to find out about it, but there was no official publication in journals, in academic journals, about the money. But so I did find this one paper. And I still can't get over, I've been working on this for a long time. Clearly, I was working on ROCR in particular since literally the day it was announced. But this particular part of the story, I've still been working on for, I don't know, weeks to months. I don't know. And I've looked at this over and over again, and it's just weird every time I see it. So we're going to get real weird now. All right. We've got the agreement 21C and Humana in September of 2012. The paper that was published in the Red Journal, the Fallet Metz paper, was in April of 2014, so just shy of 2 years after. And I'm not sure 10 years ago or whatever, because nowadays we all know the online article appears much earlier than the official publication date, and I believe that's always been the case. I honestly don't remember, but we'll have to rely on the official dates here, with the Red Journal paper being in April of 2014. 6 months later, in the JCO and the Journal of Clinical Oncology, there is a meeting abstract for the 2014 Quality Care Symposium. So a poster publication entitled, "Do Case Rates Affect Physicians' Clinical Practice in Radiation Oncology?" The first author is Brian A. Loy, Brian with a Y, and Loy is L-O-Y. And the authors appear to all be employees of Humana and Health Help. And because there's a subsequent paper that I'll bring up after this, but so we have this. It is abstract number 59. And so the background is radiation oncology practices and health plans typically engage in fee-for-service contractual relationships, which employ utilization management techniques to manage treatment accordance with recognized guidelines. And so he sets up the context of why this was done. And so methods. In 2012, Humana collaborated with a large national radiation therapy provider to implement bundled case rate reimbursements instead of fee-for-service. The case rate model was developed with Health Help, a radiation oncology vendor, a radiation oncology quality vendor. And the payments were developed in the context of the appropriate modality for each cancer type. Changes in practice patterns were measured in the Medicare population by average fraction ratios across breast cancer, bone mets, and prostate cancer. Fraction ratios compare delivered fractions to standards established by the NCCN guidelines. A ratio of 1 means that the delivered amount met the recommended guideline. Ratios nearer to 1 over under demonstrate appropriate therapy. Ratios were compared for 2011 versus 2013 using t-tests. Yada. Basically, after the implementation, the ratios did not change. Fascinating. This is the first metric here. Oh, and I forgot to mention, I'm not going to do the AI characters or anything, but that initial agreement was run on some of the standard sort of business trade publications. And if anyone is wondering how I get a lot of these things, it's one of my favorite parts of being an assistant professor is access to the university library and databases that on no planet I could afford otherwise. And so my favorite is LexisNexis. That's the company. This is confusing. I think they go by NexiUni. But if you are at an institution that has a library or otherwise subscribes, I highly recommend. It's confusing, so I highly recommend it, but there is a learning curve. But it has basically become my go-to instead of Google, because there's so many things that are paywalled and Google keeps flipping around their algorithms, and it's just a mess to find these things or to find things of interest, especially in terms of business and finance and healthcare and whatnot. So I rely pretty heavily on that. And again, it is touch confusing, but you can find a lot of things that are in the public domain, just not indexed on search engines, or at least easily available, or they're otherwise paywalled. The that's where I find most of these things, or at least that's where I start to find them. And so there was the trade publication, just the announcement, and there was then that 2014 Red Journal paper in April 2014, Fallot Mance paper, and then there was this poster publication that was done in October of 2014 for this quality symposium thing. And so there's a couple things to note about this. Number one, this is from Humana, so this is really the only sort of official publication about the outcomes or the success of this project. It didn't come from 21C or anyone associated or even physicians. It came from the health insurance company. Number two, this is the first mention I see, or the only mention, that the case rates themselves were developed through Health Help, which I cannot remember. I'm pretty sure at this point in time they've been rolled up into 8 other things. So they're probably owned by United, just like everything else. But I don't know. Don't quote me on that. Speculation. Don't quote me on that. I don't know. But that is not, I haven't been able to find anything else about this. So notice they say that is not stated in the Red Journal paper, and whatever those base rates are not stated here or anywhere else. And then the outcomes they're measuring is not related to cost, it's related to fractions. And this gets into my favorite thing to yell about. I know I say that a lot and I apologize, but the fraction shaming is absurd. And going back to things that I know that I will not say publicly because it is not public consumption, y'all got to stop. So if you are at an academic institution, like I am, and especially if you have access to things like protons or adaptive therapy and you engage in fraction shaming or the hint thereof, y'all need to stop. But it's gotten better these days, and I think I published on X, there's neat little programs that allow you to track the change of search terms over time. So on PubMed, if you look at hypofrac, it has fallen off tremendously, and it's a whole, we'll be here for 3 days. I'm going to stop right now on that. So that's what they chose to go with, was nothing else. They didn't go with anything else for an outcome here. Now, 2 years later, other than a ratio of fractions before and after implementation to the NCCN guidelines for recommended fraction, which kind of, I read that, and in my brain, that the record screech, the record stop sound, because that's not really a thing. It is, but the NCCN guidelines are notoriously vague on certain things like that, and they give a range. It is intriguing to me, it's hard for me to picture this as someone who trained in the VMAT era and basically sticks with the NCCN guidelines. And I know it's hard for me to reconcile these sorts of things because I know it's out there. I've practiced in a lot of places, I've talked to a lot of people, and I know it exists. Crazy stuff, or not crazy stuff, but things that theoretically shouldn't be done, and not necessarily in a patient harm sort of way, but in a absurd sort of way. Because there's fraction shaming in that somebody does 44 fractions for prostate and somebody thinks they're a demon for not doing 20 or 28. That's silly. That's dumb. But then there's like doing 20 fractions for a simple bone met, or adding in weird IMRT boosts for sensitizations with half gray fractions, or there's just weird stuff out there. But taking all the rest of the story aside, trying to design a study with this as your endpoint of looking at the ratio of applied fractions or performed fractions and guideline fractions, there isn't really such a thing, really, especially if you're going to use the NCCN guidelines. People can disagree with me on that, but that's an odd endpoint. But it is reasonable. Like it is something to look at in addition to other things. Namely, the whole point of this is to study, again, money. So is the finances, are they drastically different before and after on each end of the part, on the practice side or on the payer side? The number of fractions should be secondary to 1, financials, 2, administrative burden, 3, quality, which because it's a really hard metric, but basically, and the same with efficacy. But what I'm trying to say is this is a nice to know endpoint. This isn't your primary endpoint. It's weird to make it not only your primary endpoint, but essentially your only endpoint in something like this. But whatever, that's just a poster. So the paper of this data was finally published in PLOS One a couple years later. Similar authors, again, from Humana and Health Help. And the title is Do Case Rates Affect Physicians' Clinical Practice in Radiation Oncology and Observation Studies? So again, PLOS One, open access, so you can go find it. It was received on October 13th, 2015, accepted January 31st, 2016, and published February 12th, 2016. All right, this starts up in 2012. You have the Red Journal article in 2014. You have the abstract in the JCO in later 2014. And then you have this paper in early 2016, about 3.5 years after the pilot payment model was enacted. ROCR original flavor. You would think this would be it, right? That this is where you'd see how it went. So in the abstract, similar sort of intro. This time, instead of just those 3 sites, they looked at bone mets, breast, lung, prostate, and skin cancer. Same endpoint of concordance with clinical guidelines before and after the payment plan, so 2011 and 2013. And the spoiler alert was there was no significant changes, and the money was not mentioned. But let's see, let's read the paper here. So standard sort of hand-wavy intro, as we all know and love. The final paragraph of the introduction. In August of 2012, Humana Inc., a national health insurance provider, and 21st Century Oncology, a large for-profit radiation oncology multi-site provider, executed the first known contract for case rate payments in radiation oncology. The design of the payment model has been published previously, yet there is inadequate evidence in the literature to determine whether case rate payments affect patient care in radiation oncology. Therefore, the study examined whether the introduction of the payment method had an effect on the quality of care as measured by the radiation fractions administered when compared to clinical guidelines. Wow. So that's certainly an interesting choice. Again, I disagree vehemently that this is a good endpoint, a surrogate endpoint for quality of care. It is certainly a thing. I'm not saying it's not important at all, but I would not make this number one of my determination of quality of radiation therapy. It is not the number of fractions. That is not the sole thing, all right? And that's crazy. But let's see what else this paper has for us. So in the methods, it is a retrospective study comparing the proportion of patients receiving guideline-based care in 2011 under fee-for-service and in 2013 after case rate payments were introduced. So they intentionally did not do 2012 because it was introduced towards the end of 2012. So I've always assumed reading this, their fiscal year calendar goes from September to October year over year, which doesn't line up with calendar stuff. But so Humana's administrative data claims were used for the analysis. Data from 2012 were not assessed. The study population comprised of individuals residing in 20 states, with the highest concentration in Arizona and Florida, with commercial or Medicare insurance provided by Humana. Look, I could rip that apart too, but the confusing part about this, the other problems with what I just read aside, is that I think this was only in effect in Florida. So this is where I cannot find anything, and believe me, I go down a lot of rabbit holes. To my knowledge, the study population, the payment plan was only for 21C in Florida. The 21st Century Oncology practices that were not in Florida, because remember, this is a giant practice, I don't believe they were under the alternative payment model thing, but if they were, I could be totally wrong about that. I just don't know because this was never been said anywhere. Maybe. But to me, how I'm reading this is that the study population was the patients in Florida, and the other patients, the control patients, were pulled from the nation. But who knows? Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. Too bad they didn't publish more on this. So they go on to talk about how it was IRB exempt, but the individual clinics run by the provider which treated the patient share common treatment protocols, and 51% of Humana members treated by them in 2013 were subject to case rate payments, and a sub-analysis was conducted for the subset of patients covered by case rate payments only. All the providers examined were overseen by HealthHelp during the entire study period, as oversight began in May 2009. By the beginning of the study period in 2011, providers were familiar with HealthHelp procedures. Again, this was so sprawling and so difficult. I think this is the first time I started to see mention of HealthHelp. I don't know if because in the SAC filings for 21C, they do talk about some of these computer-based quality things. I would guess, so either this just shows up for the first time here, or this used to be called something else and they were bought out. I'm not quite sure how HealthHelp shows up in 2009. That was after the Vestar acquisition, but who knows? Not me. But so what is it? How many patients got this alternative payment model thing? A total of 948 patients were included in the study, 433 in 2011 under fee-for-service, and 515 in 2013 after the introduction of case-based payments, or case rate payments. And I won't read the rest of this. The spoiler alert is they say that there was no change in this amazing fraction ratio. Maybe I'm going to go design some study with this goofy endpoint. And I don't know if it was a study or something else. There was another paper. I can't remember if it was an official publication, but there is an unofficial publication talking about the satisfaction of these Press Ganey scores. And so that's it. So the only mentions of ROCR original flavor, the 21C Humana agreement, we have the news stories in 2012. Oh, and then the SEC filing for 21C also mentions it one time. So in 2013, in the SEC filings for 21C, it is mentioned there's a paragraph that they engaged in this innovative pilot. Then I could not find any mention of it subsequently in any filings. Then we have the 2014 Red Journal paper, the 2014 ASCO or JCO abstract. We have this 2016 PLOS One paper, and that's kind of it. That none of them mention any numbers in terms of finance. This is the only sort of data analysis anyone does, which is this ratio of fractions before and after compared to NCCN guidelines. And cool. What a useless endpoint for what we're trying to talk about here. If you are an author of the ROCR proposal and you were heavily involved in this at your company and all this data is available, reading this, especially this part, I know this data exists. The numbers are out there. Let's see them because it gets better. So that's the official stuff. Let's move on to the unofficial stuff. And unofficial is not the correct word, I guess, not published in academic journals or on, I guess that's all, because whatever. Next up, I found that it appears to have been some sort of seminar or talk or some sort of company corporate-based day that Dr. Mance had spoken at. And this one, I don't think I'm going to put this up on Figshare just because I'm not sure of the copyright stuff around it, but Google it because that's where I found it. So it's called Bundled Payments in Radiation Oncology, Case Studies in Innovative Specialists, Value-Based Payment Initiatives, Specialty Payment Reforms that Reduce the Cost of Procedures. So this is a slide deck. It gives an intro of what is 21C and then why is radiotherapy good for these sort of value-based payment things. So bundle payment model should be as inclusive as possible. Payment schedules include all common cancer diagnosis and services, covering 98% of all radiotherapy episodes. Uncommon diagnosis and services are excluded and paid per fee for service. Commercial and Medicare Advantage products are included. Separate payment schedules may apply. No geographic rate differentials. Multi-year terms with annual payer-provider reviews. Utilization is assessed against contractual benchmarks to evaluate for possible underuse of services. Pricing is updated per utilization changes observed in the prior term, and additional services and insurance products are considered for inclusions. This language here, and similar to the Humana paper, it's funny, with Humana's out here publishing in journals, this makes me wonder, did this pilot program spread beyond Florida? Was it 21C and Humana nationally? I have seen no documentation to indicate as such. And also with the nature of what I think the seminar was and the way the slide deck is written, this is more maybe pitching it to a generalized audience of something that the people in attendance could consider for their own systems. I'm not sure. These are the common talking points for all of these case-based payments, but it is interesting. I wish, again, I'll just keep saying it, I wish we had more information. And similar to this, so the next slide is full payment made immediately by the payer, less applicable deductible and coinsurance upon receipt of claim that reports ICD-10 diagnosis code covered under the agreement, single trigger code, and then he gives the clinical treatment planning codes of 77261, 262, and 263, which is different than the other documentation that says, or that the Red Journal article, where it says that consultation triggers payment. Was it the Red Journal article? I don't even know, but because it's not consistent. And this makes more sense, and I think this is what ROCR is, and what I would suggest as well is that the clinical treatment plan code should be the thing that triggers the episode and not the E&M that happens before that, but who knows? No inlier outlier provisions or risk adjustments. Same full rate is paid regardless of the number of treatments or risk factors. Separate bundle payments for multiple episodes. One caveat: if a patient requires treatment for a same diagnosis previously treated and reimbursed within the prior 90 days, then that payer does not make another payment to the provider. interesting things about this. And this is similar to ROCR, actually to a T. And it's interesting because when APM was on the table, one of the things that people had issue with, including the author of this PowerPoint, is that there was no sort of adjustment for severity of disease, or it was just all flat. And then suddenly but that was okay back then in the 21C arrangement and is okay now in ROCR. So there's no risk adjustments. And then same with the bundled payments with the 90-day thing, where that was an issue with APM. And that's actually one of my biggest issues with ROCR as it is written now and APM as before, where the single payment covers anything that can happen. And my example from the APM days was small cell lung cancer and prophylactic cranial irradiation, which I know is not that particular thing in terms of the medicine of it is in flux, but that would be something that you would always have to eat the cost of one of them. Or radiation oncology these days moves increasingly towards treatment of metastatic disease. And so patients in a metastatic situation and why they would receive radiation therapy, there can be multiple reasons why someone would receive, multiple legitimate reasons why a patient would be given more than one course of radiation therapy in a 90-day window, in a 3-month window. And it doesn't have to be this way, but whatever, that's another sort of thing. Next slide is called quality measures should emphasize process. Process measures, as in total dose, number of treatments, selection of treatment technology, are easily reported in radiation oncology. Measuring quality using clinical outcomes is particularly elusive in cancer care. Disease and toxicity outcomes become manifest over many years. Attribution of outcomes is often not direct, as patients commonly receive surgery, chemo, and/or other drug therapy during the course of their care. And sure, it's interesting because I don't disagree with this, but the solution is not to reward practices for being accredited using the accreditation system that your organization gets paid for. And also, maybe don't publish about fraction ratios. The stakeholder goals on the next slide: payers reduce unit costs, bundled rates negotiated to yield an aggregate decrease, mitigated treatment intensity risk, bundled rates are constant regardless of the technology utilized or the number of treatments, decreased administrative costs, change in provider economic incentives, eliminates payer needs for inefficient pre-authorizations as operational model changes to pre-notification. Sure, yeah, absolutely. So let's see the numbers. I agree. How well did it work? Because we have those numbers, or we could get those numbers. And then there's more stakeholder slides. We'll just breeze on through here. So the bundle program execution reconciliations for incomplete care episodes can occur quarterly. Pro rata payments to payer. Incomplete episodes are infrequent, 2% of all cases. Services are reported using legacy claims management systems and pended for later comparisons to clinical benchmarks. CPT data are then analyzed for non-compliance, as in underutilization to agreed benchmarks. And man, this slide deck sounds an awful lot like ROCR. And so, which leads to a lot of questions, basically, where this, again, was surprise for the vast majority of us. And while they contracted with Wakely, the consulting agency, a subsidiary of HMA who did the workforce study, they basically, the only thing that was unique was the way they calculated the base rates. And that's basically what it seems is that CMS had developed methodology for the base rate calculations from ROAPM, and then Wakely came in and took that and looked at what that methodology was and then just updated it a bit and adjusted it. And then the rest of ROCR, which is still a bare bones sort of deal if you're talking about standalone, unique payment systems for a medical specialty, this slide deck in particular, it's more granular than the red journal paper. And a lot of this sounds awfully familiar. So then we finally get into results. And the results are patient satisfactions, cost of care, compliance with care benchmarks, or that is the proposed what this slide deck is going to be. So the patient satisfaction, I wish this was a little bit more granular. Basically, there was a leading patient satisfaction surveyor, independent one, allegedly. There was 30 questions about their experience, and the patients liked the bundled service, which, yes, I presume they did. And then there's some graphs about the patient satisfaction, cost of care. So this is about as close as we get to official data, or barely official data. Modest discounts over current episode care costs may be negotiated through bundled pricing. Additional savings are realized through original payment coverage of repeat care episodes involving a recently treated diagnosis, as in within 90 days. Metastatic cases contribute 15 to 20% of all cases. Example, Mets of bone, brain, lung, and liver. Episode care costs $2,500 to $7,500 per case. And so then the next slide still labeled cost of care, but there's two line graphs. So one is same diagnosis retreatment within 90 days. It went down from 12% to 0.5% or so. And then mean number of treatment sites per episode went up 1.3% to 1.7%. That's not costs. I guess this is what extrapolating it out. What does any payment system incentivize? So it is cost in a roundabout way. Cost doesn't have to mean money, but this to me, as someone who is an active, busy practicing radiation oncology, leads questions based on how I know that I practice. And if specifically the same diagnosis retreatment within 90 days, it, in an absolute sense, 12% to 6%, 6.5%, it's not a lot of patients, but there's a 50% drop, which makes me wonder, what were these doctors doing? And it is what it is. If they want to optimize, it is what it is. I don't know. I'm not going to speculate. But that would not be, if this were my practice, I can tell you right now, there would be no change in these two things. Again, not to pass judgment, this was a different era, which now brings me finally, at last, to the uncomfortable part of this whole story. So one evening, I stumble upon a patent, a United States patent, abandoned, meaning it had been filed, and usually when this happens, when you have an abandoned patent, it's because you stopped paying on the administrative fees because it's the United States and everything costs money. So it's an abandoned patent by one Constantine Mance from Fort Myers, Florida. And this is, if y'all have ever read patents before, they're a little clunky. Sometimes there's no kind of set format, but they're a little clunky. So here is just a overview of the patent, the times, and a relevant paragraph from the several pages of descriptions of the invention.
United States Patent Application Publication. Provisional application filed on September 10, 2012, by Constantine Mance in Fort Myers, Florida. Patent abstract. A computer-based system and method for determining clinical appropriateness and medical benefits for one or more proposed specific medical managements of a medical condition, and the reporting of procedural and cost-related information for the same. Paragraph 00. Procedural codes describe specific medical procedures and are defined by the American Medical Association Common Procedural Terminology Manual. These codes constitute the set of billable units that the healthcare provider may invoice the insurer for payment of services for the patient policyholder. For each procedural code, a set of business rules and calculations exists to account for relationships with other related services, such as bundling of charges, and to accurately determine the correct number of billable units for a specific case. For instance, fixed treatment, disease, and patient information variables for a medical management of a specified disease or medical condition can, by input into the system, in order to determine a set of medical and technical procedures and calculate their related costs and the fixed overall cost for the proposed specific medical management under an episodic payment, bundled payment, or capitated payment reimbursement system.
Cool, huh? As you can imagine, I was not expecting to find this. This came up when I was literally scouring every database on the planet for any sort of additional data or publications about this pilot program. And when this came up, I didn't know what it was. So this was just total happenstance because I aggressively search the internet always. So let's back it up a little bit as to what's going on here. Patents have an interesting sort of lifespan. The things to note about patents is now, ever since 1995, you can file what's called a provisional patent. So if you try to go and submit a regular patent or file a regular patent, and I encourage people to go look at this particular patent or others, they're very complicated. They're often not written in standard language in terms of easy to read. And it's usually quite difficult to ascertain if what your invention is truly original and so on and so forth. But in 1995, they included the laws that you could do a provisional patent which means basically you just file a form that says you intend to file a more comprehensive patent, which is what's happened here. So if you look on the top of the first page, the provisional patent for this was received or filed on September 10th, 2012, and the Business Wire announcement of the Humana 21C deal was from August 8th, 2012. A charitable reading of this patent would be that it has nothing to do with the pilot and therefore is not applicable to concerns about ROCR or what's going on here. But that's awfully coincidental, because if you look in the SEC filings for 21C and kind of the whole discussion, one of their secrets to initial success and what ultimately came back to bite them, as was discussed in that Third Bridge interview, was their computer systems. And it could be thought about that perhaps this was tied into that, but it's filed in Dr. Manz's name instead of 21st Century Oncology. And so that's item one. And then item two is, wow, that is a coincidental sort of timeline. And so reading further, because I've had to read this thing many times because it's kind of confusing, this is the relevant bits to our discussion here.
Treatment, disease, and patient information variables can be put into the system in order to determine a set of medical and technical procedures and calculate their related costs and the fixed overall cost for the proposed specific medical management under an episodic payment, bundled payment, or capitated payment reimbursement system. Once a determination of benefits has been made in a case, the system then makes an objective assessment of the relative costs and clinical appropriateness of other medical services, also known as alternative predefined clinically appropriate medical managements, that would have otherwise been appropriate clinical choices for the case. The invention calculates two separate scores of merit, a clinical appropriateness score and a cost score, also known as valuation information. The clinical appropriateness score compares the requested medical service proposed specific medical management against other appropriate services, as in predefined clinically appropriate medical managements, for a given case, with the intent of informing the insurer and provider of the relative clinical utility. For example, the provider may be notified that his requested service returned a clinical appropriateness score of 5 on a scale of 1 to 10, whereas another service for the same case has a clinical appropriateness score of 9. This clinical appropriateness score is based on clinical management guidance statements and predefined appropriateness scores from medical specialty societies and other consensus groups, as well as the observations of utilization of those services within the insurer's claims database. The cost score likewise draws comparisons between requested and other appropriate services, but on the basis of relative cost and/or procedure cost versus alternative procedure cost. For example, the insurer may be informed that service A will cost twice as much as service B, but with similar clinical appropriateness scores.
So I want to begin by saying I actually like this idea, and because we're always just going to go back to nuance, where this is actually reasonable if you think about it. In the world of healthcare, we have to provide a service and we have to get paid for that service, and somebody has to pay for it. And in the current American system, there is inherent tension in that interplay. And for somebody to win financially, and again, that's where this whole, isn't this fun, the ethical sort of implications of all this, but taking the patient side out of it, the whole reason for doing any of this, putting that aside, for a practice or doctor or whatnot to get paid more, the entity that is doing the paying is having less money. That is it. That's the whole game. There is a middle ground of each party doesn't get paid or keep the maximum amount of money that they could, but both parties could benefit to a certain extent. And that's what this is to me. And that's what episodic payments are, right? Where the theory behind it, and why I do think they're a good idea, is that it prevents one side from dominating at the cost of the other. And I actually would like a system like this. And that was the theory behind the whole EMRs in the first place. But so reading this particular patent and knowing the context of where it came from, it seems like to me, we'll just use an example. If you have a patient comes in with early stage breast cancer and you put in all the clinical variables in the ICD code, then the system would theoretically, actually reading this too, maybe I would say, I want to do XYZ treatment. So I'd input that into the system. The system would take all of my inputs and run it through an updating database, an always updating database, and say, if Dr. Becta was to do this, then it would cost this, and it would double check what I want to do against the database of guidelines, and it would assign a score of what I want to do, a clinically appropriate score, and then it would, I don't know if I would see this part of it from my reading the patent, there would be a cost function calculated that would at least be seen by the payer and the practice management, and then it would suggest alternative treatments and give them a score as well. And it would balance the appropriateness, which goes back to why I think the fraction ratio thing is goofy from the Humana papers, where there's wiggle room, right? There is no singular sort of way to do things. And it is theoretically possible to assign values. But then that's where this gets problematic, is where are these values coming from? This is not handed down from high on stone tablets or a burning bush. This is designed by humans. My main problem, man, do I say it a lot, because I don't know. I'm going to have to rank order them. The issue I have with ROCR is what happened with ASTRO issuing Choosing Wisely, if you guys remember that, despite them deleting it, and the hypofrac white paper guidelines, where once that's out there, private payers can go to the races with it. It was for a while, if you wanted to do conventional fractionation for prostate, Avicor would fight you to the death. They have subsequently finally updated their guidelines to include conventional fractionation, because in the overturns, like, that's still there's nothing definitive has ever been done to this point in time that says hypofrac for prostate is better than conventional. That data does not exist. It might not ever exist. So that is in the realm of medicine, data-driven choice. And when you start putting out these things, these official statements and documents, going back to the tension between the parties involved and finances, it's going to be attempted to be exploited as much as possible. And I have an opinion on prostate cancer treatments, which I know for a fact it differs from some of my colleagues in my current department. But at the end of the day, everyone is doing something that is backed by evidence, which is all that really matters. The opinions on what is better is often subjective and lacks hard data. And that's where this gets into trouble, where who is making this ultimate sort of decision? Well, I agree with this software invention in general, in principle, and actually would probably like to have it myself. This ties into my concern over the bizarre ROCR timeline. And so finally at the advocacy breakfast here at ASTRO, the annual 2023 meeting on the Monday morning at 7 a.m., they gave a timeline. And so it was introduced at the end of June, or dropped, announced, however you want to say it. The rest of us heard about ROCR in June 2023. And if you look at this ROCR legislative strategy key milestone slide that was tweeted out from one of the social champions, is that Q4 2023, which is now when I'm recording this right now, the last bullet point is possible bill introduction. And then we still haven't seen a legislative draft or any of that. We haven't heard anything about this. And in Q4 2024, they have included ROCR in lame duck Medicare legislation or standalone. The concerning part about this is the speed, but also that fits within the confidentiality period of a patent. This wasn't even on my radar. So this was not something I had even thought about as a possibility. But so this particular patent from Dr. Mance is abandoned. And what that legally means is a few different things. But to my understanding, if the fees that are paid, you can reattain this patent. Again, I'm not a patent lawyer, but I think that's not what I'm saying. What I'm concerned about is if there is another patent, we wouldn't know about it. And it is theoretically possible, given this timeline, that the patent would not be disclosed until the legislation had already been introduced into the Congress. Obviously, again, neon flashing signs, that's speculative. But that's been the crazy part of this whole thing to me, is just this came out of nowhere and seems to be moving at a lightning fast pace for something that has never been done before. And no, the ESRD thing, none of that, what is being proposed with ROCR as legislation this is new. There's nothing you can compare to this to. And that's a whole other episode about when they keep referencing the ESRD thing, that was President Bush vetoed that. It was part of a bigger bill that was vetoed by the president, which then was passed through a supermajority in Congress. So if that's the flag you're standing behind, good luck. But I digress. Because in this patent, while this particular one is abandoned, nothing is stopping anyone from doing this in a different way, like in making a new invention. And the language of this is one where a specialty society would benefit from this as well. It's literally in black and white, where specialty societies, their guidelines are determining an appropriateness score. And it's all just so circular in terms of conflicts of interest here, where you have this proposed legislation that within the language of what we know about thus far, there is incentive to be accredited by the specialty society that is proposing this legislation. And then you have this patent from before that, to be clear, is not explicitly about ROCR. This is about the 21C Humana pilot from back in the day, but that this is what ROCR is based on tremendously. And we wouldn't know if something like this had already been filed, either provisionally or otherwise. And if there is a clinical appropriateness score, if something like this is developed or has already been developed, then the specialty society would also be determining the appropriateness score. And that's wild. Hopefully this has nothing to do with anything, because again, this was an accident. This wasn't even on my radar, because I do think in general that there's nothing nefarious going on in general. And so my brain didn't jump to secret patent, but finding this blew my mind and has me very concerned about how many things are lining up in a very circumstantial, speculative way, because I'm not accusing or claiming anybody of anything, to be really clear. I'm just talking about what exists. This patent exists. This is the timelines. This is what could happen. I don't know. But this led me down a further rabbit hole. So once I found this, trying to figure out what was going on here, I discovered that the federal government had audited Humana and claimed that Humana owed them $200 million for overpayments in the period of 2015. So that's a little confusing. I think 2015 for sure, but some things that you read will say 2013 to 2015. But so in 2015, chiefly, these overpayments came from Medicare Advantage plans in South Florida. And let's roll that tape.
A Humana health plan for seniors in Florida improperly collected nearly $200 million in 2015 by overstating how sick some patients were, according to a new federal audit, which seeks to claw back the money. The Humana audit, conducted from February 2017 to August 2020, tied overpayments to medical conditions that pay health plans extra because they are costly to treat, such as some cases of cancer or diabetes that have serious medical complications. Auditors examined a random sample of 200 patients' medical charts to make sure the patients had the diseases the health plans were paid to treat, or that the conditions were as severe as the health plan claimed. Based on those 200 cases, auditors used a technique called extrapolation to estimate the prevalence of such billing errors across the health plan. As a result, we estimated that Humana received at least $197.7 million in net overpayments for 2015, the audit states, adding that Humana's policies to prevent these errors were not always effective and need improvement. Humana did persuade the OIG to shave off about $65 million from its initial estimate of the overpayment. In 2015, Medicare paid the plan about $5.6 billion to treat about 485,000 members, mostly in South Florida.
It's worth noting that Humana contests this. Of course, they would. They just countersued the government in, I can't remember which court they introduced it in, but it was in September. The core of their argument is not necessarily around things that make sense to the rest of us, but basically that the problem with a lot of these audits, these are, if folks remember RAC audits and things, this is what the government usually does, which makes sense. It would be borderline insane and impossible to manually go through every single case. So what they do is they take a random sampling of, in this case, 200 patients. They look at what was paid, what was done, so on and so forth. And then they say, all right, when these 200 patients, we should have paid you X, but we paid you Y. So let's extrapolate that out over how many patients you did get payment for, and you owe us $200 million. Not a perfect system, sure, and that's a whole other debate for another time. But so the lawsuit is essentially that Humana claims that CMS did a whole bait and switch on them, basically, where they changed up their calculations and whatever, it doesn't matter. But so it is being contested. So again, all these are allegations. And it's just awfully coincidental that we have this 2012 pilot. We have Humana employees publishing data later on, as late as 2016, on this. And so it's definitely still at play during the time of this audit. And although, to be fair, I know that from case records, which we'll get to in a second, that was not in the paper. The paper was 2011 and 2013, but I'm talking about the PLOS One paper. And we have this patent, which describes a computerized system that has interplay between the physician practice and payer. And it is conceivable that the information could be used to generate the risk score and about how Medicare Advantage payments are received or doled out by the government. And of course, nobody was looking specifically at this. So it's just happenstance where the government didn't, I've read through the OIG audit, as anyone can do. And so they're not looking specifically at this 21C pilot. They're just looking at the whole thing. And it's just coincidental that Humana derives a pretty hefty portion of its revenue from Medicare Advantage plans in South Florida. So if you go in through and look at the SEC filings for Humana for 2015, they talk about how they provide health insurance coverage under CMS contracts to approximately 2,753,400 individual Medicare Advantage members, including approximately 587,400 members in Florida. These Florida contracts accounted for premiums, revenues of approximately $7.8 billion, which represented approximately 26.3% of our individual Medicare Advantage premiums revenue, or 14.5% of our consolidated premiums and services revenue for the year ended December 31st, 2015. That's a lot of money. South Florida accounts for a large chunk to this day of Humana's business, specifically Medicare Advantage. Specifically, that's what the payment model with 21C involved. And the government audited them and said, we overpaid you by $200 million, pay up. They're fighting that. We have this patent that could influence the risk score, not influence, but it could be contributed to it. We know that from the Humana papers that Health Help and Humana worked to develop this, and seems that's a lot of coincidences. I don't know. Okay. That's an uncomfortable amount of coincidences. Perhaps the trick with a lot of these things, the government might already be looking into this. You just don't know until they drop the hammer. And while I haven't seen anyone else put this together, it doesn't mean that it hasn't been, which we'll get into this will lead us into the final plot twist. But I don't know. Maybe it's all unrelated. I don't know. But let's turn our attention to the second to last bit, the bit right before the M. Night Shyamalan twist, where obviously, while I did not attend Astro, I'm not an Astro member, and I did not pay for the edited on-demand content, I aggressively followed every single X post that was made and tried to find any information about ROCR or anything like this, because again, that's been the issue, the dearth of information. And then to supplement that, also using my favorite databases and news outlines and whatnot. And imagine my surprise when ROCR popped up on something called the disclosure wire. So again, a bunch of these companies have to file things with the SEC. So Accuray, one of the non-bankrupt companies at the moment, gave an investor presentation, which has to be filed with the SEC. And Dr. Constantine Mantz happened to be invited to speak at the investor presentation. And now on my end, the disclosure, I have not been able to find any sort of financial ties between Dr. Mantz and Accuray, at least none that have been disclosed. So this was total coincidence. I think. I don't know. But yeah, I just don't want to imply that I am aware of any sort of financial ties between Manson and Accuray. Accuray is an interesting company. And actually, that's the thing. I like Accuray. I like competition. I don't like monopoly. So as much as I love Varian, I love you, Varian, but you're getting close to monopoly. And it's not your fault. You're just really good at what you do. But I like monopoly. So I am rooting on Accuray. That's the funny. Even if I don't agree with everything, I want all these companies to win, because then the rest of us win. So anyway, just my little sidebar about free market. With Accuray, they had brought Manson to talk about ROCR and what that is. And prior to that, they had shown a clinical trends in radiation therapy growth. So this is available on sec.gov, and they have this platform called EDGAR. And so this slide, they did projected 5-year and 10-year growth percentage in change in projected RO claims. And it's interesting for a lot of reasons. So obviously, when you're a company, you're going to spin things that is in your favor. And Accuray is big in the SBRT, SRS space. That's their whole business model. And so their projected growth for, I'll just read the 10-year one. So in 10 years from now, their conventional radiation projection is down 10%, brachy down 23% for LDR and 22% for HDR. Protons down 10%. But the growth, they are showing an 18% growth in SRS, a 34% growth in IMRT, and a whopping 79% growth in SBRT. Now, I don't necessarily disagree with what this is. It's interesting, and projections are hard. Forecasting is hard. But that's pretty wild that they're projecting an 80% growth in SBRT claims over the next 10 years. And of course, it would make sense that you're going to be interested in how we're reimbursed. And that was what Dr. Manson was brought in to talk about. So we'll have a clip here. So this is available on Disclosure Wire. This is the transcript of their presentation. And he rehashed what I believe to be the talk from the advocacy breakfast earlier, those slides. But in the Q&A session, I found this part to be quite relevant. So this is a transcript of Manson himself.
When we project these trends to 2030 and forecast volume growth and case mix, we see a nearly 30% growth in patient volumes, largely driven by prostate and metastatic cases. Note that advanced technologies such as stereotactic therapy and IMRT are standards of care for many of these cancer types, and so from the perspective of the purchaser, future capex need to be allocated for systems that can deliver these advanced treatments well, and the improvements in treatment accuracy and precision enabled by these advanced technologies have promoted the use of fewer treatments for course. However, fewer treatments apply a downward pressure on revenues under fee-for-service, particularly for non-stereotactic treatments, where per-unit pricing is less. At present, the growing demand for RO services buffers very effectively against declines in individual case revenue. Here, we show our revenue projection that compares ROCR payments to current Medicare fee-for-service. The bar graph shows average case payment under fee-for-service in blue and ROCR in orange. After an initial period where payments are discounted to provide a required level of savings for congressional approval, ROCR payments stabilize and then begin to rise slowly, while fee-for-service payments continue their downward trend as fractionation is anticipated to continue to decline. I should state that for all the groups whom we've discussed this model during this meeting, and also other groups prior to this meeting, particularly the American Hospital Association, and some other organizations representing facilities, that the reaction to the model has been extremely favorable, that the stability of payment, that it appears to ensure, particularly for a high capex, high opex business, such as radiation therapy, provides confidence in order to make the capex commitments that the field and its positions are going to be demanding as clinical data continue to accrue in favor of hypofractionated schedules and stereotactic treatment.
He's not wrong. That is a reasonable thing to state from a business standpoint. It is painting things in a certain light, of course, because the other option is to just not replace expensive equipment, which is what we're seeing now. And this was posted on X recently, where in general terms, the lifespan of a LINAC is about 10 years. And there is data suggesting that the per capita LINAC inventory in the United States vastly exceeds that of the rest of the world. And that one of the consequences of the decreased reimbursement and the poor financial progress of radiation oncology in America is that the average age of a LINAC is 14 or 15 years. I can't remember what that is. But so yes, being able to have an accurate projection of payments or payment stability is a good way to budget for high CapEx, OpEx, capital expense budget stuff. But that is assuming the payments are adequate to cover the cost of your capital equipment. And that just gets into the whole conversation about risk versus volatility. And it ultimately doesn't matter how stable your payments are if they don't cover your costs. But this was very interesting to see because GenesisCare, who bought 21C, is now also in bankruptcy, and where Dr. Mance is currently the chief policy officer. So in bankruptcy, and this is again 14 other episodes, so I'm going to breeze through this, but in bankruptcy, you're basically trying to save the company, right? Where you have too much debt, not enough revenue, things are in trouble. And bankruptcy is a way to restructure things so the company can survive in a form or a version thereof. And that's like what we just saw with ViewRay. They were unable to come out of bankruptcy. So ViewRay knew ViewRay was in trouble. They declared bankruptcy, hoping to find alternative solutions. And ultimately, there was no buyer that came through to kind of restructure and continue on. So ViewRay is a good example of what happens when bankruptcy doesn't work, where you don't have enough restructuring and capital infusion and so on and so forth to save a company. But so GenesisCare is currently ongoing and they're being more successful. So this gets into DIP financing, and you can read through this all in the GenesisCare bankruptcy proceedings. And part of the trick, or not trick, but part of the reason that bankruptcies could work would be if you are able to lay out a plan that investors believe in, that you will remain financially solvent. Basically, what is your plan to increase revenue, to decrease costs? What is the likelihood of it to work? And when you read through these GenesisCare documents, and it talks about what is the operational initiatives for surviving, there are 3 bullet points in operational initiatives. Bullet point 1 is talking about engage in a series of actions to improve net revenue collection. That's something else. But bullet point 2 is developed plans to replace its aging fleet of radiation oncology equipment. And bullet point 3 is been implementing a modernization plan of its IT and data collection services. It is awfully coincidental that you have one of the chief executives of GenesisCare, formerly 21C, at an investor presentation talking about the legislative proposal that he has helped author and that was piloted earlier. The selling point is the stability of payments in terms of CapEx predictions, in terms of the likelihood of buying expensive equipment, and that this is a cornerstone of the DIP financing of how GenesisCare is going to survive. And then also seeing the patent with the software, and that the IT infrastructure is part of the plan as well. Again, I am not accusing anyone of anything. I am interested because I did not expect to see any of this. This was all happenstance. This was not, when I made that first podcast about ROCR, it was mostly about what the heck, where it came out of nowhere and it was confusing. And that's, so all of this is just started with me continuing to try to find out what is going on with this weird secrecy thing. What is the plan? Because I am for, in an ideal world, we look at all the debate that happened from APM and all the wonderful ideas that people came up with and solutions. And there's a lot of stuff out there. Seriously, go look. Because we had years of this. And this was even, it's not like alternative payment plans are new. And there's a reason that Humana and 21C did this back over a decade ago. This is not new. And my initial concern was this small group of people just blindsided everyone and continues to keep it pretty secret in a very weird way. And so that's what this was supposed to be about when I started down this rabbit hole. Finding the 21C Humana payment plan was an accident, just as I was trying to read that voluminous information that is out there. The patent was accident. That was crazy. And then Mance talking at Accuray and it being published by the SEC is crazy and happenstance. And then talking specifically about stability of payments through ROCR and CapEx. And that is a cornerstone of the GenesisCare bankruptcy plan, and where he is the chief policy officer. That's pretty wild, but not as wild as where it all led me to at the very end of how I was able to get some of the financial data from this plan. So as I was going through trying to find anything else using my favorite legal databases, I happened to come upon a antitrust case from South Florida, United States versus Harwin. And let's hear the summary of that.
On September 24, 2020, the Antitrust Division of the United States Department of Justice announced the second criminal antitrust charge from its ongoing investigation into market allocation and other anti-competitive conduct in the oncology treatment industry. The defendant, Dr. William Harwin, is the founder and former president of Florida Cancer Specialists and Research Institute, FCS, the United States' largest independent medical oncology hematology practice. This is the first criminal antitrust prosecution of a healthcare provider since the mid-1990s. The indictment stems from Dr. Harwin's alleged role in a long-running conspiracy between FCS and a competitor to divvy up oncology markets in 3 Southwest Florida counties. Specifically, according to the indictment, the conspirators agreed that in those counties, FCS would perform all medical oncology treatments, like chemotherapy, while the competitor would perform all radiation oncology treatments. The conspiracy ran from as early as 1999 until at least 2016, before coming to light through a 2017 whistleblower lawsuit. Literally, all violations of the Sherman Act, the United States' main antitrust law, could be prosecuted as criminal cases. As a matter of prosecutorial discretion, however, the division has long reserved criminal enforcement for so-called per se antitrust violations, that is, cases where the type of conduct at issue, like price fixing, market allocation, and bid rigging, is so plainly anti-competitive that liability can be imposed categorically without delving into the pro- and anti-competitive effects of the defendant's specific conduct. If convicted, Dr. Harwin faces a maximum of 10 years in prison and a $1 million fine. Dr. Harwin has retained counsel and intends to fight the charge.
Given the nature of what this is, and the fact that I am already clocking in with a 2-hour something podcast here, I will not be exploring this in depth right now. I'm only going to be talking about this case as it pertains to ROCR. Obviously, perhaps not obviously, let me take that back. In this case, FCS, Florida Cancer Specialists, the competitor was 21C. And this is a criminal case, which means after a certain period of time, all of this is public record. Now, it is not on Google, and anyone can find it like me and get it, which you can do. It's not on Google, and this is pricey. So the main way, unless for other reasons court documents have been disseminated elsewhere, you have to get them off something called Pacer, and they charge 10 cents a page. This trial's big, so this was not cheap to do. But basically, this entire trial is available. Within this trial, 21C is prominently featured, as is Humana. So just as a brief overview of what happened, these charges were brought. What they're talking about there, the 2017 whistleblower case, that's another thing for another time. But it was uncovered, and then the charges were brought, and the trial took place, and there was an 11-day trial. And then the jury started to deliberate, and Hurricane Ian came and disrupted the whole thing. And so ultimately, after all of this, the judge declared a mistrial because of the severe delay due to the deliberations because of the hurricane. And then last month, so Dr. Harwin, the med-onc, had originally fought this, pleading not guilty. It's a very fascinating case in general for the future. And that guilty plea change happened on August 24th, 2023. So I don't have in front of me, I don't know if he has been sentenced yet. I don't believe so, but I could be wrong. But that is the ultimate resolution. So in this trial, the argument was that there was an agreement between 21C and FCS that 21C would do radiation and FCS would do med-onc. And in 2013, Humana unexpectedly dropped FCS from their plan, meaning that if a patient had Humana and needed medical oncology and went to FCS, they would not be covered. And that's important for the government's case because it meant that basically with the way South Florida was structured at the time and still to this day, that there was no easy solution for one of those patients where if you had a diagnosis of cancer requiring both modalities of treatment, you could get your radiation in these counties, but you could not get med-onc and you'd have to drive a significant distance. And that was the crux of it, was it, as it should be, it ultimately affected patients, real life. The interest for us is manifold here. One, you have the Humana 21C pilot payment program enacted in August of 2012. Then in 2013, Humana dropped FCS unexpectedly. This case is built on that in part. The case is actually built on something else, but that particular agreement or particular contractual change was problematic for the population of Florida. And as that excerpt from before pointed out, this is unusual. This is the first criminal antitrust case since the 90s. It's relevant to us for a couple of reasons. One, the trial rested on, in part, testimony and emails and text messages from physicians at 21C, most importantly, Dr. Daniel Doseritz and Dr. Konstantin Mance, and they both provided testimony at length. They were granted immunity from prosecution themselves in exchange for their testimony, meaning that obviously the nature of the trial was one such that technically they could be charged with violation of antitrust as well, but the government instead opted to not prosecute in exchange for their testimony. The case hinged on Dr. Mance in an email saying that there is a gentleman's agreement between FCS and 21C, which is not relevant to what we're talking about today, but that's why he's in there or in part. There's a lot to this, and I've been reading this entire trial for quite some time now, and it's literally like thousands of pages of documents. So it's just so much in here, but we'll skip all that for now. The important part is that as part of the government's case, they were, in trying to show this conspiracy, the defense for Dr. Harwin chose to bring in a healthcare billing claims expert, and they were able to obtain, basically they wanted to show that based on Medicare data, which again, we all have access to as well, that based on Medicare data, the split of radiation services and medical oncology services in these counties was no different than the rest of the country, that it was not unusual for radiation practices to provide only radiation and for medical oncology practices to provide only medical oncology, which I agree, that's actually a reasonable defense, and the conclusions were reasonable. Interestingly, as part of this, because of the Humana tie-in, I'm not sure if it was just this expert witness, his name is Greg Russo from Berkeley Research Group. I'm not sure if he put this together, or if the government put this together, or if 21C put this together, because what Russo's testimony was about the split and how the split was not unusual. But with the Humana piece and with him, they were given all of the claims data, or not all, but they were given a significant amount of the granular claims data for 21st Century Oncology from 2011 through 2017. And it just so happened that claims data was, in this case, in this trial, for the claims submitted to United and Humana, which means that we can see, and I just, the coincidences of all this blows my mind, because this was not where I thought I was going with any of this, but we can see the effect of the payment model. The payment model came in towards the end of 2012, and I presume they're on a fiscal calendar where the fiscal year is not tied up to the calendar year. But so you have 2011 to 2012 data, and then you have 2013 through 2017 data, which is the 2 years before the payment plan and the original ROCR flavor, and then the 4 years after. I just can't even believe that happened in terms of how this is relevant to all this. But So when I found the trial and was finding this, they provide, and this is up on Figshare, and I'll put it on X and stuff. They provide the years, the counties. United is the control. Humana is the experimental in that language. And they show gross charges and collections. And it's literally perfect, which is just wild for what we want to look at. And you can see that, so part of the arguments of the case was that the Humana patients were a small subset of the overall patient population for both FCS and 21C, which is true. So while these patients provide a huge percentage of Humana's bottom line in terms of these oncology practices, they're small. And you can see that in this data. So compared to United, the claims for Humana, they're much less. So both Harwin and I think Doser, it says this, they estimate that the Humana patients were no more than 5% of their practice. But the crazy thing is, so for both United and Humana, while the absolute numbers are very different, where United is much higher, you can see the charges rise year over year from 2011 to 2017. So as we all should know, charges do not equal collections. And you can see that on the United side, the collections is 20-25% of charges, which that's totally normal. So normally, this is just normal, when you look at these sheets of charges versus collections, usually charges are 3.5 times what collections will be. So you want to see like a 20-25%. And so it's actually pretty good. With Humana, on the other hand, it just bottoms. So on the United side, over this time period, you pretty consistently see it ranges. Actually, 2011 was their worst collections year with 15.8%, but it hovers pretty much between 20 and 25%, which is, it's good, but it's good reasonable, like it's good average. That's exactly what I would expect to see. On the Humana side, in 2011, you have 34.73% collection. That's insane. That's really great. Now, in the absolute sense, it's relatively low. United, it was about 11.5 million in charges with 1.8 million in collections for the 15%, which is on the low end of normal. And then for Humana, it was 2.6 million in charges, 900,000 in collections for 34%. That's what's important to keep in mind about this. And it does jive with what they were saying in the trial, that Humana was a small percentage of each practice's patient population, and it all lines up. So then while United stays in this normal range, 34.7% Humana collections in 2011, in 2012, it's 23.92, still normal. And then it goes to 7.1, 6.74, 8.9, 7.49, 7. It averages to 7% collections, and that is really solid. And the number in terms of collections, basically it goes from 1.2 in 2012, right before, and then it goes down to about 363, and the highest it gets is about 756,000. So it never equals before that. And it's pretty consistent. So to me, looking at this data, it tells me that the payment plan with Humana was in effect from the end of 2012, basically at least 2013 through 2017. That is insanely tight. This is why I know they have the data, because you can see it from this criminal trial. And so that's pretty crazy. And when you go through all these exhibits, that Excel spreadsheet's government exhibit 272. And when I was scrolling through the exhibit list and looking at things, there's government exhibit 271. And imagine my surprise when it said, this data is an Excel file, please contact the county clerk's office. I took a couple days to become email buddies and phone call buddies with the Fort Myers court. Very nice people. They're actually very lovely down there, and I really appreciate them. So they were very kind enough to email me, because again, it is public record. This is all evidence. This is all accessible to the public. The Excel file with all of 21C's claims data that was used in this trial from 2011 to 2017. So I independently ran my own version of it, confirming what was shown in the trial, and it tracks. And so a couple important things about this. One, the argument could be, well, if the Humana patients were so low, then this cliff that the collections fell off is not relevant. So while the collections fell off a cliff, the patient volumes did not. And so you can see they actually consistently rise. So the lowest is in 2011, where they have of the charges or of the claims. So now it's important to note that the claims that were analyzed were not everything, meaning it was a decent chunk, and I have them on the PowerPoint here. So it was a lot of radiotherapy specific CPT codes, but it was not all of them. But it's not like one or two codes, and it's not all of them, but it's a decent representative sample. And two, so for both United and Humana, the patterns are similar in terms of how much of each code that they examined was charged. So 77418 and G6015 have the same sort of patterns and whatnot. And two, the volume of service just goes up. So it's 1,984 claims were submitted to Humana in 2011, and then it ends in 2017 with 5,923. And there's multiple other patterns that you can discern and things that line up. And basically, again, we're 2 hours in, and this is a lot. So I'm not going to explore that right now. But when I was originally reading through this trial, the transcripts alone of the trial, I think it's well over 1,000 pages. And I was wondering, because initially I didn't get all the transcripts at first. And I was wondering, did anyone else see this in the trial? Because this was not what they were trying to show. Again, this trial was pre-ROCR. Nobody, like this, what I'm using this for is not what they wanted to use it for. But it's so obvious that it was wild to me, and I could not figure out why it wasn't being talked about. And I finally, it's like a single sentence, basically. One of the witnesses that they called was somebody who worked with Humana, because it was talking about like why was FCS dropped. And it's on day 6, volume 6, the September 14th, 2022 trial transcript. And it is down on page 108. And it wasn't even in, this is like in the cross. So it wasn't even in the direct exam. And they talk about this data, and I don't know. But again, they were talking about this for a different reason than what I'm interested in. But so finally talking to this Humana person about this data. So the question from one of the attorneys was, so let's just look at 2013 and 2014. For 2013, the total billed is $5 million and only $363,000 was paid. Answer, yes. Question, much less of a percentage than United, correct? Answer, yes. Question, and for 2014, same thing, $8 million billed and only about $750,000 paid. Answer, correct. Question, so just to compare the two companies that the government picked on this chart, would you agree with me that United pays a higher percentage than Humana? Answer, based on this data, yes. However, Humana pays capitation as well, which is not included in this data. Question, I'm talking about the data the prosecutor showed. Answer, yes. Mr. Marcus, thank you. I have nothing further. The court, any redirect? Mr. Marcus, no redirect, Your Honor. The court, all right, I'll excuse the witness. That's it. Clearly, not clearly. This is criminal testimony, and that makes sense, where if there was some case rate agreement and there's some payment, and for this trial they were just pulling claims data with CPT codes to compare, that would not be seen in the CPT codes probably. Now in the plan names, because in the Excel file I obtained, it does talk about the plan names. It suggests that, I don't know, it's confusing, which is the whole point, is looking at this. The argument for ROCR is that fee-for-service is bad and is going to keep cutting revenue, cutting reimbursement. ROCR is necessary because it will stabilize payments, and it will initially be a small discount or a small hit, and then over time, it's worth it. And this is the same thing with APM. So when APM made a similar sort of claim where CMS was like, with APM, this is how much it's going to cut reimbursement, and then people independently analyzed it, and it was like, no, this is not the case at all. That's what we're seeing here, where it is clear that from this data, reimbursement drastically was cut. We have this testimony from this Humana employee saying that there's capitations paid. Now the thing is, which I think is again, it's under oath, I hope it's true. I think it's true. In an absolute sense, we're talking about a company with $1 billion in debt. And the Humana patients in the collection, so even though in a relative sense it bottomed out the reimbursement, we're talking about less than $1 million. And to a company with $1 billion worth of debt, do they really care? And the marketing, like if you go through the SEC filings, the marketing budget for 21C per year was like $20-30 million. It blew this away. And the question I have is you saw this in Business Wire, they published it. It's a form of marketing. It's a form of PR. It was in the SEC filings. It could be considered just the cost of doing business. And if I'm wrong, let's see the data. So now we know this data exists, right? We have this data from the trial. We know it. We have 4 years of data from this trial where that payment plan was still in. Dr. Mance is still at this company, so they can have access to it. Humana published on it, so Humana has things. This data is clearly out there. I think at this point, it's worth, because this could change my opinion. So part of my issue, just to reiterate it, is not that I'm against episodic payments. I'm against secrecy. And if we see the full granular data, and because I assume the base rates are different, right? So it's 15 for ROCR, 13 for the 21C. They published the base rates for ROCR, but we don't know what the base rates were for here. It is possible that once we see the financial data, this program is amazing and that it's the best case scenario. And it would definitely help me and presumably others support this endeavor. But that's only part of the story. So just to wrap this all up for now, because I know this is a lot for me to take in, and I assume there's a lot of people who are hearing and seeing this for the first time too. So we'll just put a pin in here. Initially, when ROCR was announced in June of 2023, one of my concerns was, where did this come from? So APM was permanently shelved, and this was on nobody's radar, and then all of a sudden, this was announced. So conflict of interest number one is that the independent consulting agency that was engaged to develop the rates for ROCR, Wakely, is a subsidiary of HMA, which is the company that did the workforce data. And it is clear that ROCR, we know now ROCR was based on this, so technically started a decade ago. But if you look at the Excel files that ASTRO has in their blog to model the effect of ROCR on your practices, if you right-click on those after you download them and look at properties, you can see that Dr. Mance created the file, or it was either Mance or Hubbard or one of them. One of the Excel files for the ROCR math was created in February of 2023. So clearly that was being worked on since then. The workforce paper was published in March of 2023. So even you can claim it's circumstantial, but that's for a fact. So the ROCR Excel documents, February 2023. So we know that they were being worked on together. And what's more is that Wakely in the technical documents states right out that they pulled data from HMA to make their base rates. And Wakely is a subsidiary of HMA. Finally, I had emailed in that episode that I did about ROCR, I think the original one, 2 months or 3 months after I had emailed Wakely asking about that increase where it would imply that we would be doing 14,000 WR views on average. They finally emailed me back and CC'd Ann Hubbard saying that it was a coincidence. That was not what they meant, that they used other stuff from the HMA data and that it was a coincidence. Now, they did not give me, part of the reason I haven't talked about this or explored this is they gave me nothing else. So if that's true, then what do you mean? What did you pull from HMA? And how, that's quite the coincidence if that's your case. I don't think they're lying to me, and I just think it's just stretching the truth, or I don't even know what to think because they gave me nothing, and I wasn't going to engage with, as we have seen from ASTRO, they don't engage well. So I was going to go back and forth with them. But so item one, ROCR was written with companies that were tied together outside of ASTRO. It was done before the workforce stuff was published. It was done in pretty much absolute secrecy. And that was where this all started, was what I was concerned about. Then, this is well documented on this podcast and on my X account and other things, we've just gotten bare minimum from ASTRO. We've gotten the pretend town hall where they didn't really take live questions, and I don't know, very confusing. They updated the FAQ, and I know they're listening to this, so I know that the FAQ on the blog was updated in response to my podcast and without really answering things. But so that was updated. That was a change, but that was done quietly, so there was no announcement about that. Then at the national, at that presidential Biden thing, that was, I don't even know what that's called. It's not the moonshot anymore. It used to be the moonshot. We had ASTRO giving a brief talk, bringing up ROCR and that side by side with Flash. We know how serious that is. And that was the first time we had heard anything. So we've had the initial announcement with the pre-recorded webinar. Then we had the town hall. We had the FAQ updated. We had the national presentation thing where this was briefly brought up. And then we finally had the advocacy day thing, the advocacy day breakfast. And so that was the first time where the timeline came out. And that was really what this episode was supposed to be. So when I started to put this together, I was going to be talking about that because really the information that was presented at advocacy breakfast was nothing really new. So the two new things was basically there's the timeline. Mance showed some slides with some math that is interesting about 390 million, which is a thing for another time. Then Sarah had showed some stuff. It was all handwritten. It was really brief. And there was some new stuff, but barely. And then we have this Accuray thing, and that's basically it. And I've heard, again, all of the things that I'm talking about here is I'm going to save all the hearsay gossip that I have been told for myself. I'm not going to share that. And so these are all things that either I have experienced directly or can find in the public record. And that's where this was supposed to be. But so now I'm very concerned about this whole thing, where originally I was worried about secrecy of ROCR and this year in 2023 with HMA and Wakely. So now we have 10 years ago, this pilot program between 21C and Humana that heavily involved Dr. Mance and who is heavily involved in ROCR. Nobody has brought this up, least of all him. And that's crazy because either it worked or it didn't. If it didn't work, it's a learning experience. If it did work, it's a learning experience and advertisement. And if it didn't work, then we have things to fix. And that's the thing, is that part of the knocks on APM was that there was no pilot done. Like that was what should have been done. And same with ROCR, that was one of my concerns, but they did do the pilot. It's very similar now. And if it's not, please tell us why. And that requires talking about it. So we have 10 years ago, this pilot that was done and some things published, but not really, but all this data is out there. Why haven't we heard anything about it? And then that leads us into the patent that is for episodic payments. I don't even know how to describe that. It's now abandoned, but given the aggressive timeline of ROCR, it's conceivable that another patent exists. Is that true? Am I crazy? And I don't want to accuse, again, I'm not accusing anyone of anything. In my heart of hearts, I don't think that there's another patent, but now I don't know. This wasn't even on my radar. This isn't even something I had considered, but there was a patent for the same or similar thing 10 years ago by the guy who helped write this proposal. So now it's on the table of, okay, does it exist? And then we have GenesisCare is in bankruptcy, and part of their plan is to replace their Linacs. We have Mance at the Accuray investors meeting talking about how the ROCR proposal is great for CapEx because of stability of payments, and that would incentivize people to buy capital equipment, which again is planned for GenesisCare getting out of bankruptcy. And that's not even the kicker, is this criminal trial where he has immunity. If ASTRO is serious about getting unique legislation passed through Congress, they're out here deleting workforce talks. I don't even need to talk to anyone to know why that happened. It doesn't matter, because I was surprised they even put it up. And do you think this behavior is conducive to trust, to the government wanting to play ball with you? How do you think CMS is happy that you are trying to do an end run on them? And do you think that's a good look for us? Do you think this represents the specialty? That's my concern here, is how do we look? How does 2023 look for radiation oncology, and why? And if we're out here writing viewpoints in JAMA Onc about bad PR, look in your own house. None of this is good. I don't want to be recording this podcast. This is not plan A for me, but this went from me being highly concerned earlier in the year to now alarmed, where we have this guy who was investigated by the FBI and granted immunity in a clinical trial in a senior position on the ASTRO board, writing legislation for something that he did before, didn't tell anyone about, is now going to try to push through Congress. We get ASTRO trying to 1984 us and delete things they don't like and then lie about it. Come on. Is this how we want to be? Is this how we're going to attract medical students into the specialty? I don't think it is. And I would remind people that you are not obligated to be involved with ASTRO. I've talked to a lot of people because I have learned that I am the main source of ROCR information, weirdly, because no one else is talking about it. A common thing I hear from folks is when I talk about how I'm concerned about this is, well, ASTRO is doing what's best for us. What other choice do we have? We have to listen to them. No, we don't. Okay, that is not the only option. And people need to stop just going on autopilot, which is what this is. And while I think most people at ASTRO mean well and are doing their best, and I genuinely believe that, there is no obligation for any of us to just go along with it or to know that what they're doing is best. And that was where this was supposed to start with, was I don't know, I'm trying to find out. And now I ended up reading a criminal trial. Do better.
This has been a Photon Media production. Don't forget to like and subscribe on whatever platform you use to listen to us. Be well and be Mom.